You ever notice how a place can feel completely different after closing time? The words were spoken quietly by a tired line cook wiping down the stainless steel counter. But no one answered because the restaurant had already fallen into that strange midnight silence where every small sound seemed louder than it should be. Outside, the neon sign buzzed faintly against the cool Texas night, its red glow reflecting off the rain-speckled sidewalk. Inside, chairs were stacked on tables, the scent of grilled steak and butter still hanging in the air, and the last few employees moved slowly through the routine of closing. The front door opened with a soft metallic chime that almost no one noticed. A tall man stepped inside wearing a dark baseball cap and a plain gray jacket, the kind of outfit someone chooses when they don't want attention. He paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the warm amber lighting of the dining room. Most of the staff didn't even glance up. To them, he looked like any late-night customer who had wandered in too close to closing time. But the man wasn't a customer. The man was Vin Diesel, and this restaurant belonged to him. He liked to do this sometimes, drop by quietly, without calling ahead, without security, without the kind of announcement that makes people behave differently. He wanted to see how things really ran when nobody thought the boss was watching. For a moment, he just stood there, listening. The hum of refrigerators, the clatter of dishes in the back, the low murmur of employees talking as they counted tips and finished their shifts. Everything looked normal. Then he heard something that made him stop walking. A sound, soft, almost hidden beneath the clink of glasses. Someone crying. Vin tilted his head slightly, listening again. The sound came from the hallway near the storage room, a narrow corridor behind the kitchen where the fluorescent lights flickered and the walls smelled faintly of detergent and cardboard boxes. He took a slow step forward, then another, the heavy soles of his boots barely making a sound against the tile. The crying grew clearer as he approached. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet kind people make when they're trying very hard not to be heard. When he reached the edge of the hallway, he stopped again. The voice belonged to a young woman sitting on the floor beside a stack of supply crates, her dark work apron still tied around her waist. Her name tag, slightly crooked, read Aaliyah. Her shoulders trembled as she wiped her face with the sleeve of her uniform, trying to catch her breath before anyone walked in. Just a few feet away, a man stood over her holding a clipboard, his posture stiff, his tone cold and impatient. "You should have thought about that before tonight," the man said flatly. His name was Richard Caldwell, the night manager. Aaliyah shook her head quickly, her voice breaking as she tried to explain something through tears. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong. I promise. I was just trying to help the table." Richard sighed like someone who had already made up his mind. He tapped the paper on the clipboard and said, "Customer complaint. That's all corporate needs to see." Vin Diesel stood frozen in the dim hallway light, listening to every word. Aaliyah Carter tried to steady her breathing, pressing her palm against her eyes as if she could wipe away the humiliation as easily as tears. The hallway felt colder than the dining room, the fluorescent light above them flickering every few seconds with a quiet electric buzz. Her uniform shirt was still damp from the long shift, the fabric clinging to her shoulders after nearly 10 straight hours on her feet. The restaurant had been busy tonight, busier than usual for a Wednesday, and every server had been rushing from table to table carrying trays, refilling drinks, and smiling through exhaustion. Aaliyah had done the same thing she always did. She worked quietly, kept her head down, and tried not to cause trouble. This job mattered too much to lose. Richard Caldwell looked down at the paper on his clipboard again, as if the printed complaint meant more than the person sitting on the floor in front of him. His polished shoes reflected the pale light from the ceiling as he shifted his weight impatiently. "The customer said you made him uncomfortable," he said, his tone flat and official, like someone reading from a script. "He said you argued with him and embarrassed him in front of his guests." Aaliyah quickly shook her head again. "That is not what happened, sir. I was only explaining that the kitchen had already closed the grill. I offered to bring him something else. I even offered to pay for the appetizer myself." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she forced herself to finish the sentence. "I was trying to help." Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. That is not what he wrote in the complaint. From the hallway entrance, Vin Diesel remained perfectly still, watching the scene unfold without revealing himself. The dim light cast a long shadow across the tile floor behind him, but neither of them noticed. He had been inside hundreds of restaurants in his life, but something about the way the young woman sat there made the moment feel heavier than a simple workplace disagreement. Aaliyah glanced down at the wrinkled piece of paper lying beside her. It was the termination notice Richard had printed just minutes earlier. Her name was typed neatly across the top. Seeing it, there had felt like the ground disappearing beneath her feet. "Sir, please," she said quietly, forcing herself to stand even though her knees felt weak. "My mother has medical appointments every week. The insurance only works if I keep this job. I will take extra shifts. I will clean tables. I will do anything you need. Just please do not fire me." Richard finally looked up from the clipboard, his expression unmoved. "You should have thought about that before upsetting a paying guest." The words hung in the air like cold fog. Aaliyah clasped her hands together as if trying to hold herself together at the same time. "He was already angry before I even got to the table," she said softly. "He kept saying he did not want someone like me serving him." She hesitated before finishing the sentence, the memory clearly painful. "I still tried to be polite." Richard frowned slightly, though not with sympathy. "Customers say a lot of things when they are upset. That does not change the fact that we received a formal complaint." He tapped the clipboard again. "And complaints mean paperwork." Aaliyah lowered her eyes, the quiet hallway suddenly feeling even smaller around her. The smell of cardboard boxes and cleaning spray filled the air as a distant dishwasher rattled somewhere in the kitchen. For a long moment, she did not speak. Then she whispered the words that had clearly been sitting in her chest all night. "I just needed this job." In the shadowed entrance of the hallway, Vin Diesel slowly exhaled, the sound almost silent, but the tension in his jaw tightening as he continued to listen. Richard Caldwell adjusted the collar of his dress shirt as if the conversation had already ended and he simply needed to wrap up the paperwork. The clipboard rested against his forearm, the corner of the termination notice peeking out beneath the metal clip like a verdict that had already been decided. Aaliyah Carter stood in front of him now instead of sitting, but the hallway still made her feel small. The fluorescent light flickered again, casting a faint shadow across her face. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and tried to straighten her apron even though her fingers were trembling. For a moment neither of them spoke. From the kitchen came the distant hiss of the industrial dishwasher and the low hum of the walk-in refrigerator motor. It was the ordinary soundtrack of a restaurant closing down for the night, but the silence between them carried a different weight. Richard flipped one page on the clipboard and tapped it with the end of his pen. "You have been here, what, 3 months?" he asked without looking directly at her. "Almost 4. Aaliyah answered quietly. "I started in early spring." Richard gave a small shrug. "That is not a long history with the company." Aaliyah swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "But my record is good. I have never been late. I cover shifts when people call out. I stayed until 2 in the morning last week when the weekend crew needed help." Richard nodded once, as if acknowledging a detail that made no difference. "Work ethic is appreciated," he said flatly. "But the customer experience comes first." In the shadowed corner near the hallway entrance, Vin Diesel remained silent, listening carefully. The overhead light caught the edge of his jawline as he leaned slightly against the wall, watching every movement. He had built this restaurant with the idea that people should feel respected on both sides of the table. Customers mattered, yes, but so did the people working the long hours behind the scenes. Hearing the conversation now, he felt something unsettled forming in his chest. Aaliyah clasped her hands together again as she spoke. "The table had already been upset before I even greeted them." One of the guests kept saying. "The service was slow even though the kitchen was backed up. I told them I would bring fresh drinks while they waited. I kept smiling. I kept saying thank you." She paused briefly, her voice tightening with emotion. "But then he said he did not want someone like me serving his table." Richard raised one eyebrow as if the phrase were simply another complaint in a long list of minor workplace problems. "People say things when they are frustrated," he replied. "That does not mean you challenge them." Aaliyah shook her head gently. "I did not challenge him. I only said I was there to help." Richard looked down again at the paper. "According to this statement, you raised your voice." "I did not raise my voice," she answered quickly. "I only told him the grill had closed for the night." Richard sighed with quiet impatience and held out the pen toward her. "Sign the form, and we will process the separation tomorrow." The pen hovered between them in the pale hallway light. Aaliyah stared at it for several seconds, as if it weighed 50 pounds instead of a few ounces. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Down the hallway, Vin Diesel slowly straightened his posture, his eyes narrowing as the moment stretched longer and heavier in the silence. Aaliyah stared at the pen in Richard Caldwell's hand, as if signing that paper would quietly erase the last 4 months of her life. The hallway light flickered again, casting a pale shimmer across the smooth tile floor, and for a moment, she could hear her own heartbeat louder than the humming refrigerator down the hall. She slowly lifted her eyes from the pen and looked at Richard with a fragile mix of exhaustion and determination. "Sir, please listen to me one more time," she said carefully, her voice steadier now even though her hands were still trembling. "I did not argue with that customer. I kept apologizing even when he kept raising his voice. I offered him 3 different menu options after the grill closed. I even asked the kitchen if they could reopen the station for just 1 order." Richard shifted slightly and glanced toward the kitchen door as if the conversation was taking longer than he preferred. "The kitchen told me they were already cleaning the grill," Aaliyah continued, trying to keep her voice calm. "So I offered him dessert on the house. I offered coffee. I offered to bring fresh bread while they decided." She paused for a second, remembering the table clearly now, the polished wooden surface, the half-empty glasses, the impatient faces. "But he kept saying he did not want me serving him. He kept saying he wanted someone else." Richard's expression remained stiff and professional. "And instead of calling another server, you kept talking to him," he replied. Aaliyah shook her head quickly. "I did call another server. I asked Megan to take the table. But before she got there, he said something that made the whole table quiet." Her voice lowered slightly, as if repeating the memory still carried weight. "He said people like me should stay in the kitchen where customers do not have to see us." The words hung in the narrow hallway like cold air. Richard looked at her for a moment without responding, then slowly clicked his pen against the clipboard. "Customers are not always polite," he said finally. "That is part of the service industry." Aaliyah pressed her lips together as if deciding whether to say the next sentence. "I know that," she answered softly. "But I still kept smiling. I still said thank you. I still told him I hoped he had a good evening." She lifted her hands slightly as if showing they were empty. "I did everything the training manual says we should do." From the shadowed end of the hallway, Vin Diesel watched closely, his gaze moving between the young woman and the manager holding the clipboard. The calm way she spoke caught his attention. There was no anger in her voice, only someone trying to hold on to dignity after a long shift that had clearly taken everything out of her. Richard glanced down again at the paper. "The complaint says you embarrassed him in front of his guests," he said. "That affects the reputation of the restaurant." Aaliyah exhaled slowly, as if letting out the last piece of strength she had left for the night. "Sir, I only asked if he would like to speak with a manager because I could not reopen the grill." She looked directly at Richard now. "That was when he said he would make sure I never worked here again." Richard tapped the clipboard again, the sharp sound echoing slightly in the hallway. "And now we are here," he replied. The pen remained extended toward her, waiting for her signature. Aaliyah looked down at it once more, the thin plastic barrel reflecting the fluorescent light, and the silence stretched long enough that even the distant kitchen noises seemed to fade. In the shadow behind them, Vin Diesel slowly pushed himself away from the wall, his footsteps beginning to move quietly down the hallway toward them. The pen in Richard Caldwell's hand remained extended, hovering in the narrow space between them like a quiet ultimatum. Aaliyah Carter stared at it without moving, her eyes reflecting the cold fluorescent light above. The restaurant behind the kitchen had nearly gone silent now. Most of the staff had already clocked out, and the few remaining workers were finishing the last pieces of cleanup. Somewhere in the distance a metal tray slid across a counter with a faint scraping sound. Then everything settled again into that heavy late-night quiet. Richard cleared his throat softly, the sound sharp in the hallway. "We do not need to make this more difficult than it has to be," he said, his tone patient but firm, the voice of someone who believed the decision had already been finalized. "Sign the document, turn in your apron, and Human Resources will process the separation tomorrow morning." Aaliyah swallowed hard. Her fingers curled slowly into the fabric of her uniform apron as if she needed something to hold on to. For several seconds, she did not move at all. Then she finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper but steady enough to carry down the hallway. "Sir, If I sign that paper, it means I am agreeing that I did something wrong. Richard's expression tightened slightly. It means the situation is resolved. Aaliyah shook her head gently. But it is not the truth. The words came out quietly, yet they seemed to echo in the narrow corridor. Richard glanced briefly toward the kitchen entrance, as if checking whether anyone else might overhear the conversation. The truth is that the customer felt uncomfortable, he replied. And that reflects poorly on the restaurant. Aaliyah lifted her eyes to meet his again. There was a tired strength in her expression now, the kind that appears when someone has already reached the end of their patience but still refuses to let their dignity disappear. He was uncomfortable the moment. He saw me, she said softly. Richard did not respond right away. He simply held the pen out again. That is not something the company can investigate, he said. But complaints are something we can document. The clipboard tilted slightly as he adjusted his grip, the paper rustling in the quiet hallway. Sign the form. For a moment Aaliyah looked as if she might finally take the pen. Her hand lifted halfway before stopping in the air. She stared at the paper again, at the typed letters of her own name near the top of the page, and her shoulders slowly dropped as if the weight of the entire night had settled on them. I cannot sign it, she said. Richard exhaled through his nose, the patience in his voice fading. Then you are refusing to cooperate with management. I am refusing to lie, she answered. The sentence hung between them longer than either of them expected. From the dim entrance of the hallway, a new set of footsteps echoed quietly across the tile floor. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Neither Aaliyah nor Richard had noticed them before, but the sound carried clearly in the late-night stillness of the restaurant. Richard turned his head slightly toward the corridor just as a tall figure stepped forward out of the shadows. The man removed his baseball cap as he entered the light, revealing his face fully for the first time. For a brief second Richard simply stared, his eyes widening as recognition settled in. The clipboard lowered an inch in his hand. Aaliyah looked confused, glancing between them as the silence stretched. The man spoke calmly, his voice deep but controlled. Before anyone signs anything, Vin Diesel said, I think I should hear the rest of the story. The hallway fell completely silent after the words left Vin Diesel's mouth. The faint hum of the refrigerator motor in the distance seemed louder now, filling the space between the three of them. Richard Caldwell's hand slowly lowered, the clipboard tilting toward the floor as if gravity had suddenly become heavier. For a moment he did not speak. His eyes moved from Vin Diesel's face to the baseball cap now resting in Vin's hand, then back again as if his mind was trying to confirm what it had already recognized. Mr. Diesel, Richard finally said, his voice suddenly careful, the confidence from a few seconds earlier fading into something tighter. I did not realize you were visiting tonight. Vin Diesel stepped a little further into the light, his boots making a quiet sound against the tile. His expression was calm, but his eyes were focused and observant. That was the idea, he replied evenly. Aaliyah Carter stood frozen beside the stack of supply crates, still trying to understand what was happening. She had seen the man's face before, of course. Anyone who watched movies recognized him. But the realization that he was standing here in the hallway of the restaurant where she worked made the moment feel unreal. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she quickly looked down again, unsure whether she was supposed to speak. Richard straightened his posture, adjusting the front of his shirt as if trying to recover control of the situation. We were just resolving an employee complaint, he said quickly. Nothing serious. Vin Diesel glanced at the clipboard still hanging loosely in Richard's hand. It sounded serious enough from where I was standing, he said. Richard forced a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. It is standard procedure when a guest files a complaint, he replied. We simply follow company policy. Vin's gaze shifted slowly toward Aaliyah. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slightly slumped, the sleeve of her uniform still damp where she had wiped her face earlier. What is your name? He asked gently. Aaliyah, she answered quietly. Aaliyah Carter. Vin nodded once, committing the name to memory. Aaliyah, he said, I would like to hear what happened tonight. She hesitated, glancing briefly at Richard as if asking for permission. Richard spoke before she could answer. The customer claimed she raised her voice and embarrassed him in front of his guests, he said quickly. The written complaint is very clear. Vin held up one hand slightly, not in anger, but in a simple request to pause. I heard part of the conversation already, he said calmly. I would still like to hear her version. The hallway seemed to grow quieter as Aaliyah slowly lifted her eyes again. For the first time since the confrontation began, someone was asking her directly instead of speaking about her. She took a slow breath and clasped her hands together in front of her apron. The table arrived around 9:30, she began carefully. There were 4 people. They ordered drinks and 2 appetizers. Everything was normal at first. Richard shifted his weight beside them, but did not interrupt. Aaliyah continued, her voice steady even though the memory clearly weighed on her. When I came back to take the main order, the man at the table asked for a steak that requires the grill. But the grill closes at 9:30 during the week. The kitchen had already started cleaning it. Vin listened without speaking, his attention focused completely on her words. I explained that we had other options on the menu. Aaliyah continued. I even offered to ask the kitchen if they could reopen the grill for one order. She paused for a moment before finishing the sentence quietly. That is when he said he did not want someone like me serving his table. The words settled heavily in the hallway air. Vin Diesel's expression did not change, but the stillness in his posture became even more noticeable as he listened. Aaliyah's voice grew quieter as she reached the end of that sentence, as if repeating the memory had drained the last bit of strength from her. The fluorescent light above flickered once again, casting a pale glow across the narrow hallway. Vin Diesel did not interrupt. He simply watched her carefully, his arms relaxed at his sides, but his attention sharp. For several seconds nobody spoke. The faint hum of the refrigerator motor filled the silence. Finally Vin asked a simple question. What happened after that? Aaliyah drew in a slow breath before answering. I told him I could ask another server to take the table if he preferred, she said. I said I just wanted to make sure he had a good experience. Richard Caldwell shifted slightly beside them, the clipboard still resting against his side. Vin's eyes moved briefly toward him, then back to Aaliyah. And did you call another server? He asked. Yes, Aaliyah replied. I asked Megan from the next section to come over. She was already carrying drinks to another table, but she said she would be there in a moment. Her hands tightened slightly around the edge of her apron as she continued. But before Megan arrived, the customer stood up from his chair. He said if the restaurant could not serve him properly, then he would make sure management heard about it. Richard cleared his throat lightly. Which he did, he said, tapping the clipboard once. Vin did not look at him this time. His attention remained on Aaliyah. Did you raise your voice? Vin asked calmly. Aaliyah shook her head immediately. No, sir, she said. I only told him I would bring the manager if he wanted to speak with one. She paused briefly, then added, I thought that would calm things down. Vin nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. And did you call the manager? He asked. Aaliyah glanced once toward Richard before answering. Yes, she said softly. I came to the back to find him. The words hung in the air for a moment. Vin's gaze shifted toward Richard again. And when she came to find you, he asked. Richard straightened slightly. She seemed upset, he replied. The dining room was getting tense, so I stepped in and handled the table myself. Vin tilted his head slightly. Handled it how? Richard hesitated for the briefest second before answering. I apologized to the customer for the inconvenience and offered a complimentary dessert, he said. Standard recovery procedure. Aaliyah lowered her eyes again as he spoke. Vin noticed the movement immediately. Aaliyah, he said gently. Did the customer accept that? She hesitated before answering. He said he would accept the dessert, she said quietly. But he also said he would still file a complaint. Richard gave a small nod as if confirming the story. Which he did online before leaving the restaurant, he added. Vin remained silent for a moment, thinking. The hallway felt even narrower now, the quiet stretching between each sentence. Then he spoke again, his voice calm but more focused than before. Richard, he said, when a complaint is filed, what is the usual first step? Richard answered quickly, as if reciting company policy from memory. We review the situation and speak with both the employee and the guest when possible. Vin nodded slowly. And did you speak with the employee before preparing that termination notice? The question lingered in the air. Richard's grip on the clipboard tightened slightly. I spoke with her briefly, he said. Vin's eyes moved from the clipboard to the paper clipped to it. The typed termination form was still visible beneath the metal clip, waiting for a signature that had not come. He looked back at Richard, his expression calm but unreadable. Briefly, Vin repeated. Richard Caldwell shifted his weight again, the edge of the clipboard pressing slightly into his palm. The hallway seemed smaller now that the conversation had slowed into careful questions and measured answers. Vin Diesel remained still, studying both of them with a calm that made every second feel longer. Aaliyah Carter stood quietly beside the supply crates, her hands folded in front of her apron, unsure whether the situation was improving or about to collapse again. Vin finally looked back at the clipboard in Richard's hand. "May I see the complaint?" he asked. Richard hesitated for a brief moment before handing it over. The paper slid free from the metal clip with a soft rustling sound. Vin read the document slowly, his eyes moving line by line under the fluorescent light. The complaint was typed neatly, the words formal and confident, describing a server who had allegedly embarrassed a guest and disrupted the dining experience. After several seconds, Vin lowered the page slightly and looked at Aaliyah. "Is there anything here that is not accurate?" he asked. Aaliyah took a cautious step closer so she could see the paper. Her eyes moved across the lines, and she quietly shook her head. "Some of it is not accurate," she said softly. "I did not refuse service. I offered other menu options." She pointed gently toward one sentence. "And I did not raise my voice." Vin nodded slowly and folded the paper once before handing it back to Richard. "There is something missing from this report," he said calmly. Richard frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Vin leaned lightly against the hallway wall, his voice steady but thoughtful. "You mentioned earlier that the customer was uncomfortable the moment he saw her." The sentence hung in the air. Aaliyah lowered her eyes again. Richard cleared his throat quietly. "Customers can be particular," he replied. Vin's gaze remained fixed on him. "Particular about what?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Preferences about service," he answered carefully. Vin was silent for a moment. Then he asked another question. "Did any other employee witness the conversation at that table?" Aaliyah nodded slightly. "Megan heard part of it when she came to help," she said. Richard glanced toward the kitchen, as if calculating how quickly that information might travel through the staff. Vin noticed the glance immediately. "Is Megan still here tonight?" he asked. Aaliyah shook her head. "She left about 20 minutes ago." Vin nodded once and folded his arms loosely. The quiet hum of the building filled the hallway again. "Richard," he said, "when I opened this restaurant, I told the management team something very simple." Richard did not respond, but his posture stiffened. Vin continued, speaking slowly. "A restaurant only works when everyone inside it feels respected. The guests, the cooks, the servers, everyone." His voice remained calm, but there was a firmness behind the words now. Richard forced a small nod. "Of course," he said. Vin looked toward Aaliyah for a moment, noticing the tired expression on her face and the faint redness around her eyes from crying earlier. Then he turned back to Richard. "You said you spoke with her briefly before printing that termination form." Richard nodded. "Yes." Vin tilted his head slightly. "And during that conversation, did you ask her what the customer actually said to her?" The question landed softly but directly. Richard's grip on the clipboard tightened again. For a moment he did not answer. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above them as the silence stretched. Finally he said, "The customer's written statement was enough to proceed." Vin studied him quietly for another long second. Then he pushed himself away from the wall and stood fully upright in the narrow hallway. His voice remained calm, but carried a new clarity now. "Then I think we need to proceed differently tonight." The hallway remained quiet after Vin Diesel spoke those words. Richard Caldwell stood still, the clipboard pressed against his side, his expression caught somewhere between uncertainty and calculation. Aaliyah Carter did not move at all. She simply watched the two men, unsure what would happen next, her hands still clasped in front of her apron. Vin took a slow breath and glanced once more at the termination form. Then he looked back at Richard. "Here is what we are going to do," he said calmly. "No one signs that paper tonight." Richard opened his mouth slightly as if preparing to respond, but Vin continued speaking before he could interrupt. "Instead, tomorrow morning we will review the situation properly." His voice was steady and deliberate. "We will speak with the staff who were working in that section. We will review the dining room reports. And if necessary, we will contact the guest directly." Richard shifted his posture again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mr. Diesel, with respect, the complaint is already documented," he said carefully. Vin nodded once. "Yes," he replied. "It is documented. But documentation does not mean the story is complete." The words settled quietly into the hallway air. Aaliyah lowered her eyes again. unsure whether to feel relieved or nervous. Vin turned slightly toward her. "Aaliyah," he said gently, "how long have you been working tonight?" She blinked once, surprised by the question. "I started my shift at 2 in the afternoon," she answered softly. Vin glanced toward the digital clock above the kitchen entrance. It read 11:48 p.m. "That is nearly 10 hours, he said. Aaliyah nodded faintly. "Yes, sir." Vin studied her face for a moment, noticing the exhaustion that had settled into her posture. Then he looked back at Richard. "Has she had any previous complaints in her file?" Richard hesitated. "No formal complaints," he admitted. Vin nodded again. "Has she been late? Missed shifts? Failed training?" Richard shook his head slowly. "No." Vin let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. "Then one difficult table should not erase 4 months of hard work." The sentence landed gently but firmly. Richard looked down at the clipboard, then back at Vin. "What would you like me to do with the paperwork?" he asked quietly. Vin reached out and took the termination form from the clipboard. He folded the paper once and placed it on the nearby supply crate. "For tonight," he said, "we leave it right there." Aaliyah stared at the folded paper as if it had suddenly become lighter than it had been all evening. Vin turned toward her again, his voice calm but sincere. "You go home and get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we will talk again when everyone has had a chance to review what really happened." Aaliyah hesitated before speaking. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had been holding inside during the past hour. Vin gave a small nod, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge her gratitude. Richard remained silent, watching the folded paper on the crate. The hallway lights continued their faint electric buzz as the building settled deeper into the night. After a moment, Vin picked up his baseball cap again and placed it back on his head. "A restaurant," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to the room itself, "is built on trust." No one answered. The refrigerator hummed softly in the distance. The kitchen lights glowed faintly down the corridor, and the folded termination form remained untouched on the crate, waiting for a truth that had not yet been finished.